Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the absolutely legendary World War II aircraft that was a fighter, an escort fighter, a high altitude combat aircraft, a fighter bomber, and a ground attack aircraft. We are looking at the legendary Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This aircraft, also known as the Jug, was an absolute beast, weighing in at over 8 tons, making it one of the heaviest fighters of World War II. However, that did not diminish its capability, and it was well known in both the European and Pacific for its capabilities. But let's go ahead and look at the legendary P-47 Thunderbolt. Now, like the last two aircraft I've talked about, this was the brainchild of Alexander Kartveli. And this was actually supposed to be the continuation of his earlier aircraft, the P-35 and later on the P-43. However, the P-43 was supposed to become an improved version known as the P-44. However, this design was abandoned. This new aircraft was actually supposed to be a lighter weight fighter utilizing a new Allison V-12 cooled engine, twin 50 calibers along with 4 30 caliber machine guns. And the United States Army Air Corps actually backed this new proposal, and they called this the XP-47. And so the plan was that the Army Air Corps was going to have the XP-44 and the 47 compete against each other for a new fighter program. However, in the spring of 1940, the Army Air Corps determined that both of these designs were inferior to Luftwaffe fighter aircraft. And this could have been the end for the P-47. Instead, Republic was allowed to go back and redesign the aircraft. And after the first redesign, the XP-47A failed, a second redesign was created, and this became known as the XP-47B. And it's this model that became the basis of the Thunderbolt we know today. And it had several features that kind of made it unique. It had an air-conditioned cockpit that was actually rather large, and pilots complimented how comfortable it was to actually sit in this aircraft. It had both main and auxiliary self-sealing fuel tanks. It went through various engines to kind of reach where it was at. But because of how big the engine was, because of how big the propellers was, it actually had to have custom landing gear struts that could extend in order to raise the aircraft up enough to clear the propeller from the ground. Now, the aircraft wasn't without its issues. It had a high wing clearance that most pilots weren't used to. It had a rather weird system where the oil would actually burn and enter through the air conditioning system, and it would fill the cockpit with smoke. But even with some of these issues, the Army Air Force, as it was now called, ended up ordering a production run of 171 aircraft by December of 1941. Now, the first P-47s to see combat were with the 56th Fighter Group, a part of the 8th Air Force, and they actually went on to gain the name Jug, mainly because they had a very commonality with the milk jugs of the time. And while they had a funny nickname, they were a very serious aircraft. They saw their first air combat on April 15th, 1943, where they shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190. They would later go on to join the 12th Air Force in Italy. And then after that, they would join the Pacific against the Japanese. And they were actually very much admired by the Luftwaffe, mainly due to the fact that the Germans recognized that these aircraft could take an astounding amount of pounding and still fly. And this actually impressed them to the point they actually wanted their own P-47 to study. And we do have reports of at least one P-47 was captured and evaluated and tested by the German Air Force. Now, around the same time the German Luftwaffe was trying to get their hands on a P-47, the United States gave 3 P-47Ds to the Soviet Union for evaluation capabilities. And they noted the aircraft was easy to fly, had good ground stability, spacious cockpit, good ventilation, and good all-around view. They did not like the excessive roll stability and poor directional stability. And the Soviet Union ended up very rarely using the 188 P-47s they had in their inventory. But to the contrary, by 1944, the United States and its other allies had started to utilize the P-47 as the primary fighter bomber. And in fact, according to records that we have, from D-Day until VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 rail cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks, proving its ground attack capabilities. Other air forces that had success with the P-47 included the Royal Air Force, the Mexican Air Force, and even the Free French Air Force all utilized the P-47 successfully. Now, sadly for the P-47, after World War II, it was pretty much an ended program. They canceled the remaining 5,000 plus aircraft that were in production. When the United States Army Air Force became the United States Air Force, it was redesignated the F-47, and it was relegated to Air National Guard units. And eventually it would just be kind of faded out. Instead of being deployed during the Korean War, the now F-51, formerly the P-51 Mustang, would now be the close air support vehicle. And this aircraft had just kind of been pushed away. It was delivered to the Cuban Air Force, and it was actually given to the Chinese Nationalist Air Force during the Chinese Civil War for their usage. But once the war ended, the aircraft was kind of put to pasture. Now, for the relatively short career the P-47 had, it actually had quite a few unique variants. And of course, this included the earlier XP-47, also known as the AP-10, the canceled XP-47 prototype. But the remaining variants can really be broken down into two main categories: what is known as the Razorback Thunderbolts and the Bubble Top Thunderbolts. Now, the Razorbacks are the main production variant based off of the P-47B models that kind of went into that full-scale production, and they gained this name, the Razorback, due to that unique ridge line that comes from the cockpit all the way down to the tail. And this was the main production aircraft with over 9,000 aircraft created, but this production would end up being stopped with the later D variant, and this D variant became known as the Bubble Top, and this became known for its very unique bubble canopy to increase visibility. Also, this model came with increased fuel capacity and had a few of its own models and variants as well. Now, there were two major programs to actually replace the P-47, the first of which was known as the XP-72, and it was developed in parallel with the Republic XP-69 program. And this was basically a P-47 with a new engine. It had six-bladed counter-rotating propellers. It would have new upgraded avionics. They flew a prototype, but the program ended up being abandoned. Now, the second attempt to replace the P-47 was far more ambitious, and it was basically to take a turbojet engine and put it inside the body of a P-47. And due to the rather large size of a P-47, it was assumed that this could work. However, they went through a lot of different proposals and ended up abandoning this in favor of developing Cartveli's next aircraft, the F-84 Thunderjet. Now, while the career of the P-47 was relatively short with the United States, it would serve in militaries around the world until 1966, when the Peruvian Air Force finally retired it. However, the legacy of the P-47 is very well preserved, as they are on display in more than 15 countries, with more than a dozen flying examples that can be seen around the world. And there is no greater descendant of its legacy than Alexander Cartveli's last ground attack aircraft, the descendant of the P-47, the A-10 Warthog. But there you have it, a look at the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that had a relatively short career with the United States, but left an amazing impact on World War II. It was a premier fighter bomber. It was the main ground attack aircraft for the United States. And while it didn't serve for the United States very long, its legacy lives on in both legend and its descendant, the A-10 Warthog. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to talking to you on the next time.